Well, inspired by Paul, I'm now going to sing my sermon for the next half hour. Just kidding. And you'll be glad I was kidding. I heard that. In the history of TV and film, a time-honored genre is the classic Western. When I say Western, what comes to your mind? Depending upon your generation, you might think about Tombstone, or you might think about 3:10 to Yuma, either the original or the remake. Or maybe you might think about Unforgiven, or for that matter, any of the dozen or so other Westerns that Clint Eastwood has been in. Or maybe you think about The Magnificent Seven, again, original or remake. Maybe you think about dun da da dun da da dun da da dun Bonanza, okay? For you Little House on the Prairie fans, you look closely there, you see a young Michael Landon. You know, that's how Paul got his start, was actually first on Bonanza, then Little House. Or how about Gunsmoke, the TV series with Marshall Dillon? Or, you know, an all-time classic, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. I mean, if you've seen it, that's an all-star cast. Jimmy Stewart, John Wayne, Lee Marvin, all in this movie. When you think about Westerns, what is part of every Western story? The shootout, right? The shootout, excuse me, between the bad guy and the good guy is part and parcel of every Western. And so when I say classic Western showdown, your mind might conjure up an image of Clint Eastwood in any one of his many Westerns, staring down the barrel of a six-shooter at his unfortunate opponent. Unfortunate because that opponent is about to be dead. Or how about one of my personal favorites, Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday in the movie Tombstone, feverish from tuberculosis, challenging Johnny Ringo to a final gun duel. I'm your Huckleberry. Or how about dead-eyed Denzel Washington as Sam Chisholm in the remake of The Magnificent Seven? He's taking out the bad guys left and right in that movie, I think just with that stare. Or how about a sci-fi fantasy remake of the Western genre? Here it comes. The vibe of the Star Wars Mandalorian series is basically Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider, set in the Star Wars universe, as he takes on his opponents and rescues the Star Wars equivalent of the damsel in distress, Grogu, Baby Yoda. That is, if your damsel in distress is a 2-foot alien with big ears. We continue in today's sermon with a study of the authentic church as found in the book of Acts. Specifically, we'll be examining Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34, as the Apostle Paul visits the city of Athens and encounters a group of pagan Greek philosophers who think and act very differently from Paul as a Christian. As we look at this meeting between Paul and these Gentile philosophers, it might be tempting to view this as a kind of showdown. After all, the Bible itself contains some stories of classic Western-style showdowns: Moses and Pharaoh, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, David and Goliath. So is this, in Acts 17, is this an example of another showdown, this time between Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and a bunch of pagans with no respect for Paul's God and his beliefs? I mean, cue up Welcome to the Jungle, you know, the beginning of a Bengals game. Or should we understand this story very differently? Let's find out together as we see what Paul does in Acts chapter 17. As verse 16 of this chapter opens, we find Paul in the middle of one of his missionary journeys. As he travels through what we now call Greece, he arrives at the city of Athens, and as Paul looks around the city, he's greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. But then notice that verse 17 begins with the word "so," which tells us that what Paul does next is motivated by his distress at seeing the city of Athens is so full of idols. Luke tells us that Paul began looking for opportunities. He went to the Jewish synagogue and sought out his fellow Jews as well as God-fearing Greeks to speak with them. Paul also went to the agora, or the marketplace, which would basically be a giant shopping center of the city. Think of a mall, but of course, well, that seems ancient now as well, right? The mall. It's so 1990s. In the marketplace, he struck up conversations with anyone who happened to be there. And as Paul visited the synagogue and the Athenian marketplace, what was he talking about with people? Verse 18 gives us the answer. Paul was telling people the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Now, Luke goes on in this passage to give us a summary of what Paul specifically talked about with the Athenians. But before we look at that speech, I think we need to first stop and reflect on something important in this passage, and that is this. Confronted by the idolatry of the city of Athens, Paul's response to coming face to face with a pagan culture and its people was to have compassion for them and simply share Jesus with the people he came into contact with. Paul wasn't full of rage. He was distressed and truly sad for the spiritual condition of these people. This is important for us to notice because it says something about Paul and his lifestyle as a follower of Jesus that I think sets an example for us. For you see, the pre-Christian Paul would not have responded to Gentile non-believers in this way. As a zealous Pharisee, Paul's reaction to pagan idol worshipers may have looked a lot like Jonah in the Old Testament. When we hear someone say Jonah, what do we think about? Jonah swallowed by a whale, right? Let me just pause for a second. I love this picture. This artist evidently conceptualized in his mind that Jonah began writing his book while in the whale. And as he's being vomited, here comes the book with him. I just get a kick out of that for some reason. We tend to think about this whale as being the most important part of Jonah's story, probably because when we hear this story as kids, the big storm and the whale, these are the most exciting parts, right? But actually, in terms of learning the real lesson from the story, the most important part of Jonah is the very end of the book. You might remember that Jonah is tossed overboard from a ship caught in a storm and is swallowed by a whale because he tried to run away from a mission God gave him. At the beginning of the story, God told Jonah, I want you to go to the city of Nineveh, and I want you to preach there. To which Jonah said, no thanks, and hopped aboard a ship to the city of Tarshish, which all you need to know about Tarshish for the sake of this point is that it was in the complete opposite direction as the city of Nineveh, which is where God wanted Jonah to go. So that's when God sent the storm and he sent the whale to course correct Jonah and get him back on the way to Nineveh and doing what God wanted him to do. And indeed he did. Jonah went to Nineveh and he preached God's message of judgment to its citizens. And then something amazing happened. The people in the pagan city listened to Jonah and they repented. And then something even more amazing happened. Jonah threw a temper tantrum. That's right. When Jonah saw that the Gentile city of Nineveh repented, and as a result, God decided to spare the city and not destroy it, Jonah said to God, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to the city of Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity." Do you hear that? In essence, Jonah said, God, you know what your problem is? You're too loving and too gracious. Wow. And then Jonah headed to a place outside Nineveh that overlooked the city, sat down, pouted, waiting to see what would happen. And let's be clear what Jonah's doing here. He's waiting to see if God will change his mind and then go ahead and destroy the city after all. Because in Jonah's mind, this is what pagan Gentiles like these people in Nineveh deserve. They deserve God's judgment and wrath. Because in this world, there are two kinds of people. The ones who are good, like me, Jonah, and there are the bad people, like the Assyrians. By the way, you can read the rest of Jonah chapter 4 and see that God invites Jonah to care for the Assyrians as much as God himself cared for them. You see, God's plan all along was to invite the Gentiles into relationship with him, not just the Jews. Through the prophet Isaiah, God said that he was going to raise up a servant who would be a light for the Gentiles. This is in Isaiah 42:6. And as we know from the Gospels that God's servant is Jesus. He is the one who came to be a light for the Gentiles as well as for the Jews, and to unite them together in one community. As 2 Peter 3:9 says, the Lord is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. This has always been God's will, to offer salvation to everyone, Jew and Gentile, through Messiah Jesus. To that end, Jesus appeared to Paul in Acts 9. We looked at that passage in a previous sermon in this series, not only for the purpose of saving Paul and transforming him into his faithful follower, but also to recruit Paul for a mission, which was to tell the Gentiles the good news about Jesus and the fact that he wants to save them as well. Upon becoming a Christian, Paul embraced the mission that Jesus gave him, and as a result, Paul's outlook toward Gentiles completely changed. Before following Jesus, Paul would have likely shared Jonah's attitude toward Gentiles. They're pagans. I'm judging them because God is judging them. We Jews are God's favorite people, and those Gentiles are outsiders, deserving of whatever God's punishment will be for them. Pre-Christian Paul would have wanted little to do with the spiritually contaminating Gentiles. But now, as a follower of Jesus on a mission to share the good news with Gentiles about the light of the world, Paul sees the idolatry and the paganism of the Athenians not as a reason for condemning them or holding himself aloof from them, but instead as a reason to love them and compassionately tell them about Jesus. The key to Paul being prepared to fulfill God's will in Athens was his willingness to have his heart and mind changed by the mission God gave him. The mission completely changed Paul's outlook on the Gentiles, whom Paul now viewed as people to be loved rather than people to be avoided or even condemned. Thus, God turned Paul into a man who sought to passionately persuade people, how's that for an alliteration, to become followers of Jesus. Now let me fast forward for a second and preview the conclusion of this sermon today. Have we allowed God to transform our perspective toward non-Christians with the gospel mission he has given us so that we too may become persuasive Christians? Okay, now back to Acts 17, verse 18. Paul encountered a group of Greek philosophers who began to debate with him as he talked about Jesus. As they hear Paul, they say to each other, "What is this babbler trying to say?" The word babbler, as you might guess, is intended to be an insult toward Paul. Basically, these wise and scholarly philosophers are saying, well, who does this amateur teacher think he is, coming to our city, thinking himself he has something worthwhile to say? He's nothing more than a two-bit philosopher, certainly not as learned and astute as we are. But because they heard Paul talking about foreign gods that they weren't familiar with, they were also intrigued. And they're curious enough about Paul's teaching that they invite him to a meeting of the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus was a place in Athens where the scholars and leading men of the city, they'd get together to discuss the latest ideas. We might think about this as the ancient equivalent of a conference of professors or professionals to talk about new ideas and the latest research. Or maybe we think about this as the ancient Greek equivalent of the Jedi Council. That's 2 Star Wars references. Or as my wife would describe it, a nerd herd for people like me. They probably discuss questions like, what is the meaning of life? How did the world get here? How did we get here? Why do we drive on a parkway and park on a driveway? Why do people turn the radio down in the car so that they can see the road better in front of them? Is the hokey pokey truly what it is all about? Little known fact, the Greeks actually invented the hokey pokey. Now, Paul would have reacted by taking offense. He could have reacted by taking offense at being called a babbler by these hoity-toity philosophers and rejecting their invitation to speak at the Areopagus, but instead Paul gladly accepted their offer. Now let's skip ahead to the ending of this passage for a minute. As this passage comes to a close, we read in verse 32 that upon hearing Paul say that Jesus of Nazareth has risen from the dead, some of the audience sneered. However, some of them wanted to hear more. They were intrigued and hungry to get another opportunity to hear about Paul's God. In fact, in verse 34, it tells us that some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Thus, Paul did succeed in persuading some of the people he spoke with to become followers of Jesus. It's interesting to me that over the years, I've heard some Christian preachers and teachers talk about this passage as if Paul somehow failed. They say, well, Luke only mentions 2 converts. But if you look closely at what we just read, there were also a number of other unnamed individuals who became believers. We don't know how many, of course, but some heard and chose to put their faith in God. Folks, this is what happened everywhere Paul preached the gospel. Everywhere he went, some people believed, some did not. The fact that some reject the gospel is not an indication of failure. Rather, this is the reality for which Jesus prepared his disciples when he said that some will choose to accept the good news about him while others won't. They won't accept it. The Lord has left this decision to each person to accept or reject the message. The success of our mission as Jesus' ambassadors does not at all rest on how many people we persuade to believe the message or not. It's not even our job to convict people to become Jesus' followers. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 3:7, Paul clarifies that it's our job to plant the seed, water the seed, the gospel, but God is the one who makes the seed grow when a person chooses to accept the seed into their heart. So how do we become, like Paul, good planters and waterers? What can we learn from Paul as we ourselves seek to be persuasive ambassadors of the gospel? How can we be another alliteration, passionately persuasive people? First, like Paul, we need to be willing to be prepared to be effective persuaders on Christ's behalf. Remember, I said earlier that a key to the success of Paul's preaching is that he allowed the mission God gave him to transform his mind and heart. After God gave Paul his mission to be an apostle to the Gentiles, Paul thought about Gentiles differently, and he behaved differently toward them. 1 Corinthians 9:21, Paul says that in a sense he became like a Gentile in order to persuade them to become followers of Jesus. Now, Paul's quick to point out that he didn't in every way become like Gentiles. He didn't accept their moral standards or ethics, but he did seek to empathize with Gentiles by taking the time to listen to them and understand them. And he did this because he sought to love them as Christ loved them. Indeed, when a Roman centurion, a Gentile, came to Jesus and asked him to heal his gravely ill servant, Jesus commended the man's faith and agreed to help him despite the very obvious cultural and ethnic differences between himself and this man. One of the keys to the success of Paul's persuasive preaching is that he was willing to let go of his own prejudices and biases. He was willing to get himself out of the way of the message so that his audience could clearly see and hear the love of God through the message he spoke. And thus, the people were able to see that the good news is truly good news intended for them. As Christ followers, we need to ask ourselves, are there prejudices, biases, attitudes, behaviors in our own lives that we should allow God to weed out in order to remove obstacles that prevent non-believers from seeing Jesus clearly in our own lives? Second, like Paul, we need to build bridges between ourselves and those whom God gives us the opportunity to engage with. Let's go now to verse 22, to the beginning of Paul's speech to the Areopagus, this group of philosophers. First, note how Paul begins his speech there in verse 22. He says, "I see that in every way you are very religious, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you're ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Now notice the restraint Paul exercises here. Again, the Pharisee Paul would have loved to start his speech with, "You filthy heathens, you God-forsaken idol worshipers." But instead, notice he finds something nice to say. He builds common ground with his audience by saying, "I see that in every way you're very religious. You're a spiritual people. I'm spiritual as well." He says that they're so spiritually devoted, in fact, that as Paul walked around the city, he noted they even have an altar for an unknown God they might not know about. It was almost like the people of Athens were saying, "Hey, you gods out there, if there is one of you we forgot, please don't be angry. No thunderbolts and lightning, please. Very, very frightening. Hey, we built this altar for you. Sorry we don't know your name." Well, actually, Paul says, there is a God you don't know about, and it's that very God that I want to introduce you to. So he uses their spiritual curiosity as a bridge to take the conversation where he wants it to go, which is to tell them the good news about Jesus. You know, contemporary American culture is increasingly post-Christian and pluralistic. And furthermore, we live in a time of spiritual and cultural confusion. When we look around at American culture today, we hear a cacophony of voices espousing an overwhelming array of religious beliefs, philosophies, political ideologies, worldviews. We may not see the idols of stone and wood that Paul saw in Athens 2,000 years ago, but we certainly observe the various idols that vie for the attention of our fellow Americans: consumerism, vanity, power, fame. Living in the midst of a modern-day idolatrous and pagan culture, it can be tempting for Christians to draw lines of distinction between us and them, and to see ourselves in the throes of a large-scale culture war with our fellow citizens. Now, it's true that some people around us live lives far from the will of God. And yes, at times, aspects of this culture appear to be to Christians as hostile and antagonistic toward Christian faith. And thus it can be easy for Christians to adopt a posture of defensiveness, pessimism, and apathy. In fact, it's tempting to match the hostility of some secular people with our own anger and hostility. I think it's unfortunate that many Christians now see themselves engaged in culture wars with their neighbors, co-workers, and even some of their own family members as enemy combatants in this war. I would humbly submit to you that the example Paul sets in Acts 17, and really all through his missionary activity in the book of Acts, is not the example of someone who viewed himself as an aggressive culture warrior, but instead a humble follower of Jesus, seeking to tell the truth, to be sure, but to speak the truth with love and grace toward his Gentile audiences. On a side note, throughout his letters and the book of Acts, Paul saves his sharpest criticisms for religious leaders who sought to make things more difficult for Gentile non-believers to become Christians and who wanted to maintain sharp lines of division between the small group of people they envisioned being worthy of God's kingdom and the very large group of people they envisioned being excluded from God's kingdom. In contrast, we can see in Acts 17, Paul hoped to persuade as many as possible to become followers of Jesus by seeking to make connections with them. This requires Christians to love people and care enough about them to be motivated to make such connections, which means we need to generate more light than heat. I fear that in their zeal to win short-term battles about their pet culture issues, Christians are giving away long-term opportunities to share their faith unhindered by self-created obstacles like our own fears, rage, bitterness, pride, and desire for power. If we wish to gain the opportunity to gently and humbly persuade people to become followers of Jesus, we must be bridge builders and not antagonists. At a time when so many self-proclaimed Christians seem to default to rage whenever they are confronted by something in the surrounding culture they don't agree with or don't understand, we followers of Jesus must seek ways to positively connect with the people whom we want to invite to become followers of Jesus themselves. Third, we need to introduce people to who God really is as he revealed himself to us, so that people can clearly see him for who he is. In the remainder of his speech, notice how Paul explains who God is to his audience. His audience consisting of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, as well as adherents to other philosophies and beliefs. They had many different ideas about the gods and their characteristics. And so it was important for Paul to take this opportunity to help his audience become acquainted with the qualities of the one true God. So notice in verse 24, he starts with God as creator. As you can see Paul's strategy here, he explains this God who exists is the creator of everything else, and because he's the creator of everything else, he is the supreme ruler of it all. He has no equals, no rivals. His supremacy is demonstrated by the fact that, as Paul says in verses 24 and 25, he doesn't need a temple to live in, and he doesn't need anyone to serve him. Indeed, far from needing anything from us, the one true God is the one who gives us life, grants us life to all humans, and indeed everything that lives and breathes. If this God is creator and ruler of all, he subsumes all other gods and divine beings underneath him. You see what Paul does there? You see, if God existed before everything and is in charge of everything, then there is no room for other gods. That's smart. That's strategy. As he continues, notice how Paul builds a bridge with his audience. He quotes a sentiment expressed by a couple of ancient Greek poets who said, "We are his offspring." Thus, Paul was saying that even many of the Gentiles themselves believed that they were creations of divine beings. Paul's basically saying, hey, that's great. You managed to get something right about the one true God as he is on your own. That's good. In verse 28, Paul emphasizes that not only did God create human beings, but he sustains them as well. In him we live and move and have our being. God is a supporting or sustaining cause for our ongoing existence. Furthermore, verse 28 says, God made all the nations and gave them places to live. He's been and continues to be sovereign ruler over all human history, marking out the comings and goings of nations and their dwelling places. And why has God done this? Why has God created the peoples of all nations and watched over them and their history? Because he wants everyone to seek him. And not only to seek him, he desires for everyone to find him. And in fact, he's present with and close to all people in all nations. Turns out then that this God is not just a God of the Jews or a God for the Jews. He's also a God of everyone, for everyone. He extends an invitation to relationship with him to all peoples and every nation. In verse 28, Paul makes it clear to his audience that the God who truly exists does not resemble any of the idols that the Athenians built, the same gods or the same idols that grieved Paul as he toured about the city. If God is the one universal creator and ruler of all, then indeed he can't be contained or defined by any limited image of human creation. As he continues, Paul firmly maintains that God cares for all people and seeks to draw all people from all nations to himself. By creating us, he gives human life meaning, purpose, value. This one true God is an inclusive and welcoming God whose love transcends the boundaries of the nations. Furthermore, he has carefully directed all of human history to lead to this point in time when he sent the Messiah, his son, to usher in a new era. In this new era, God has made himself known to all nations through the good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And he's now guiding all of human history toward a day when he will bring justice to the world and will set things right in his creation. On this day, according to verse 31, he will call everyone to stand before him as he enacts his justice. But again, this same God is also inviting everyone to enter into a relationship with him so they may be prepared for the upcoming day when this God of righteousness carries out his vision for justice on earth. Notice how Paul keeps this message simple by concentrating on God's basic qualities, his identity as creator of the world and everything that exists, the God who gives life to all living things, including human beings, and sustains, supports, and values life. Because he's creator, God is also ruler over all history and the affairs of nations and peoples. The same God is not just the cosmic Lord, phenomenal cosmic power over all, but seeks to be a personal father to all people, one who seeks to draw near to all people and invite them to seek him, a God who wants to be found. And best of all, this God is a God who is the Savior, who has sent his appointed servant, Messiah Jesus, who has died for the sins of all mankind, and the one whom God raised from the dead as a testimony to the great compassion and kindness he wants to demonstrate to all people. Furthermore, this Messiah is the one who will return to this world to set things right according to God's own justice. We live in an age where there are so many competing beliefs and ideas about God, and there are times when Christians add to this confusion by talking about God in ways that are frankly not consistent with who God really is. So they may exclude his love and compassion, or they may exclude his justice and righteousness. Sometimes God is spoken of in ways that make him appear too small, or too angry, or too distant and aloof. To be effective ambassadors for God, we must equip ourselves with the knowledge of who God really is from Scripture itself. We must be good and faithful students of his word so that we may accurately and faithfully portray the true God in our words and in our behavior. As Paul explains our responsibility in 2 Corinthians 5:20, he says there, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on God's behalf, be reconciled to God." Are the non-Christians we interact with able to get a clear and accurate picture of who God is through our descriptions of God? If not, what changes do we need to make about how we talk about God in order for them to get better acquainted with the true God through our words? Writing to another group of people who once were idol worshipers but were now followers of Jesus, Paul has this to say in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. He says there, You know how we lived among you for your sake. You became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering with the joy given by the Holy Spirit. And you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. The Lord's message rang out from you not only in Macedonia and Achaia. Your faith in God has become known everywhere. Therefore, we do not need to say anything about it, for they themselves report what kind of reception you gave us. They tell us how you turned from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. These Thessalonian Christians became followers of Jesus because Paul had shared the good news with them persuasively, and the way he shared it with them, his life, his testimony, had evidently been so persuasive, they welcomed the good news with joy. And they welcomed it with joy despite the hardships and trials they faced in their daily lives. And so as a result, you see there, Paul says that the good news of Jesus was now so readily noticeable in the words and lives of these Christians that Paul said it was as if the good news of Jesus was ringing out from them. They were broadcasting. Okay, they were broadcasting out good news from their lives. They were, comes another alliteration, passionate persuaders of people. No doubt they were following Paul's own example, an example that is summarized for us in 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to explain the hope that you have in Jesus, but do so with gentleness and respect. If we follow this example, we, like Paul, can be persuasive sharers of the gospel of Jesus Christ in a world that desperately needs to hear good news in the midst of these perilous times. We come to a point now where it's time for us to make a decision. If you're already a Christian here today, then we have a decision to make in terms of thinking about our calling, our mission to be passionate persuaders, okay, to be prepared, to reach out to those who need to hear Jesus. And if you come here this morning and you haven't made that decision yet, we invite you to take this opportunity today to become acquainted with the God who wants you to seek him and to find him. Let's stand.